Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, a podcast about early American history with Liz Covart. The study of history is key to understanding who we are and how we can affect a better future. Ben Franklin's World will introduce you to historical people and events that have impacted and shaped our present-day world. And now, here's your host, Liz Covart.
Hello, and welcome to episode 64 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. When we think about slavery in early America, our minds tend to evoke images of African and African American plantation slaves, the men and women who were forced to labor in agricultural fields or in the homes of wealthy white Americans. These are images of chattel slavery. It was the practice of slavery that predominated in early North America, the type of slavery whereby early Americans looked upon African and African American slaves as property to be bought, sold, traded, and used as they would any piece of land or real estate or draft animals. But did you know that some early Americans also practiced a different type of slavery? Colonists in New France practiced Native American or Indigenous slavery. Native American slavery differed from chattel slavery, and today we're going to explore this little-known aspect of early American history with Brett Rushforth, author of Bonds of Alliance, Indigenous and Atlantic Slaveries in New France. During our investigation, Brett reveals how Native Americans practiced slavery and how the colonists of New France came to adopt and modify their practices, the day-to-day lives of Native American slaves, and how Native American slavery controlled French expansion in North America. But before we join Brett for our adventure in New France, I have something really exciting to tell you. Over the last year, you have emailed me questions about how historians research and write about history, how we interpret documents, and how you might engage in this work too. I have been thinking about how best to answer your questions in a way that would be meaningful, in a way that would reveal not just how historians work, but in a way that would also provide you with practical advice and interesting details about our early American past. I reached out to the amazing scholars at the Omohundro Institute of Early American History and Culture at the College of William and Mary. The Omohundro Institute supports and promotes early American history projects, and the projects they support tend to be the best in the field, which makes this a very exciting announcement. I am pleased to report that our conversations have led to a new monthly series called Doing History: How Historians Work. With the support of the Omohundro Institute, I will be able to bring you episodes that will allow us to explore aspects of early American history and investigate how historians uncovered what we know about the past with some of the best and most accomplished historians in the world. This is an amazing organization and one I am really excited to partner with because they are committed to supporting and producing high-quality historical work. And you know what? The folks at the Omohundro Institute think that Ben Franklin's World meets their high standards. They are fans of the show, and they are eager to help answer your questions. The Doing History series will kick off on January 22nd with a special bonus episode. After that, episodes in this series will air on the last Tuesday of each month throughout 2016. This is going to be so fantastic, and I cannot wait to start sharing these episodes with you. And the excitement doesn't stop there, because now we get to go meet today's guest historian and investigate a little-known aspect of early American history, the French colonial practice of Native American slavery.
With tidings and wisdom to share about our early American past, here is this week's special guest.
Our guest is an associate professor of history at the College of William and Mary. His research interests include early American history, Native American history, and comparative race and slavery. In addition to being the book review editor of the William and Mary Quarterly, our guest has authored 2 books, Colonial North America and the Atlantic World, A History in Documents, which he co-wrote with Paul Mapp, and Bonds of Alliance, Indigenous and Atlantic Slaveries in New France. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Brett Rushforth.
Thank you for having me.
Brett, before we time travel back to New France, we'd love to know more about book reviews. Now, many of us read book reviews in publications like the New York Times or the New York Review of Books. Some of us even read them on websites like Amazon.com or Goodreads.com. Would you tell us about what the William and Mary Quarterly is and whether the book reviews we'll find in it are similar to what we're reading in our newspapers, magazines, or online shopping sites?
Well, the William and Mary Quarterly is the premier academic journal for early American history and culture. It's been published at the College of William and Mary since 1892 and is considered one of the premier academic journals in the English language for the study of history in any field, and certainly for the study of early American history. So the reviews that we do in the William and Mary Quarterly try to survey recent literature on early American history defined very broadly. So that would include anything in North America before about 1815, and related histories of the Caribbean, of the Atlantic world, of Native America. And when we define North America, we also include places like Canada. Sometimes there's work on Mexico that falls in, and certainly work on the transatlantic slave trade and overseas migration that brings Africa and Europe very much into the conversation. The reviews we do are somewhat different than you'd find in the New York Times or in an online site, primarily because we are trying to have conversations among scholars about scholarly work. And often what we try to do is get the reviewers to place the recent work in conversation with other scholarly work and to highlight themes and debates and discussions that have been happening over time, and to suggest how this book might involve itself in that conversation and maybe change the way we see things. And so it tends to be somewhat more detailed on the side of historiography and probably somewhat less driven by the narrative style that you'd often see in a review in the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, or especially on Goodreads or Amazon.
Do you think that anyone who just loves history would be interested in reading the William and Mary Quarterly and find its book reviews helpful?
I think most general readers would find the book reviews fascinating. In fact, I've been surprised since I've started editing the book reviews for the Quarterly how many people contact me and tell me that they enjoy the reviews. And these people are non-academics. They're people who are interested in early American history and like to have a place they can go to see what is the latest work being done. Now, we don't review all of the literature that's coming out on early American history. We receive about 600 books a year to review, and we can only hope to review maybe 60 to 80 of those. But we do try to represent a broad cross-section of the field, the latest methodologies, the latest work in various areas, various time periods. So you can pick up the journal and over the course of a year, see what is much of the latest and most interesting work in early American history. And so I think most people would be interested in it.
Thank you for that helpful information. I suppose we should now travel back in time to New France and talk about our topic for today, which is Indigenous or Native American slavery in New France. Brett's book, Bonds of Alliance, explores slavery in New France and the relationship between Indigenous and French Atlantic slaveries. Brett, would you tell us about slavery in New France and how the slavery practiced there differed from the types of slavery practiced in British North America and the French Caribbean?
Well, slavery in New France was practiced over the course of about a century, from about the 1660s to the 1760s. And in many respects, it might seem similar to other forms of slavery, particularly in similar places like New England, for example, where the slavery was not the driving engine of the economy, where slavery was often more urban, more domestic than it was agricultural. But in other respects, it was profoundly different than other areas of slaveholding in the colonial Americas. For one thing, in New France, all the way through the 1760s, Native Americans were the primary population enslaved in the colony of New France. And that sets them apart, sets that colony apart from many of the other colonies around it, where by the late 17th century and certainly into the early 18th century, Africans and African Americans became the primary population that were enslaved. And in New France, the reason that that's different is a very complicated story that really is the subject of the book. How is it that this colony that was administered by a kingdom, France, that had some of the most vibrant plantation-based colonies in the Caribbean, how did it come to be so different? How is it that this slavery came to have sort of both a different population that was involved in it and different legal structures, different social and cultural expectations associated with it? And the answer really has to do with the way that slavery in New France drew upon both French Atlantic slavery and indigenous forms of Native American slavery that were practiced in North America long before the French arrived.
We keep mentioning the term New France, but what do we mean when we say New France? Would you tell us about the geographic area encompassed by that colony?
Sure, and in fact, there was a debate among French colonists themselves where New France was. In the broadest definition, New France was French North America, and that included everything that today we would consider Canada, the St. Lawrence Valley, and then through the Great Lakes, down the Mississippi Valley, and into what is Louisiana today. And what the French actually called Louisiana was inclusive of some places in Alabama and other areas around. New France, as I use it in the book, is the narrower definition, which is an administrative unit that really is present-day Quebec, the Great Lakes, and the upper Mississippi Valley. So if you took a swath of land from Quebec City in the St. Lawrence Valley and stretched it out to sort of Minnesota and then went down the Mississippi to Illinois, that's roughly the stretch of territory we're talking about. Now, on French maps, they would claim New France in the broadest possible terms. So if you look at a French map that was written or that was drawn to speak to other Europeans, it would show that the French claimed basically all of North America except the territory east of the Appalachians. They would say that this was all their territory because they're making these claims against other potential colonizers, Britain and Spain primarily. But when they did maps of North America that recognized what was actually on the ground, they themselves were the first to acknowledge that the vast majority of North America was still native country. And there were just small enclaves of French settlement in various places outside the St. Lawrence Valley. So places like Detroit, places like Michilimackinac, places like the Illinois country that had a couple of small French settlements. But aside from those little nodes of French population, which were very small, they would indicate that this country belonged to various native peoples.
Who are the various native peoples who are living between the Great Lakes region and Quebec as you define New France in your book?
So they're very diverse groups of people. If you look at upstate New York, which was sort of the southern boundary of New France, the people there are largely Iroquoian people. They would be considered part of the Five Nations, often called Haudenosaunee, and they would be in between New France and British colonies. And they initially were enemies of New France and eventually developed sort of grudging peace with the colony and took a stance of neutrality between France and England in their colonial disputes. To the west, and these are the primary allies of New France, the primary trade partners, etc., would be groups of Algonquin-speaking people, so people like the Anishinaabe peoples, Ottawa, Ojibwe, etc. Also Fox, Sauk, and Kickapoo, which are groups that live in modern Wisconsin, the Illinois peoples, and others that spoke similar kind of Central Algonquin languages. But then even farther away, there are relationships developed between the French and the Sioux Indians, who at the time that the French arrived in the later 17th century lived in modern Minnesota, not in the Dakotas as they might be associated with at a later period. So it's a very diverse group of people. They speak different languages, they have different interests, and many of them actually are rivals with one another for control of resources and travel space like rivers, hunting territories, etc.
How many of these Iroquoian, Algonquian, and Siouan peoples actually practice slavery?
Well, this is probably one of the most controversial aspects of the book that was something I had to wrestle with a great deal. The word slavery is very loaded because I think when most people hear the word slavery, they think of chattel slavery. They think of slavery in terms of plantations, in terms of racialized relationships between a master who owns an enslaved person. And that kind of slavery was definitely not practiced by any of the indigenous peoples of the Americas. That said, slavery historically across global cultures has so many different faces that to assume that chattel slavery is the one version of slavery that we should recognize, I think is a mistake. I think of it a lot like the term family, right? Families have lots of different formations. They're historically specific. They're defined by a group at a given period of time, and then they're contested, and those definitions change. That's the same when it comes to slavery. So the indigenous peoples of North America practiced a form of slavery that fundamentally was about the forced incorporation of enemy outsiders into one's culture. It was generally practiced as a result of warfare. Small-scale raids would often be made against an enemy people. The captives that would be taken would be either ritually killed, mostly males, especially warrior-aged males would be killed, and then women and children and younger men would be forcibly incorporated into the society. What that meant was that there were these dynamics that focused really all of the attention of slavery as they practiced it on the capturing and the enslavement process rather than on a kind of productive labor that would be the sort of defining characteristic of French slavery.
Could you give us an example or perhaps discuss the process by which Native American groups forced these captives or slaves into their communities?
Sure. So if a captive would be brought back to the village, there was a process of sorting by which often women would be the ones to decide who lived and who died. And then kin groups would make claim on these captives based on who captured them and partly based on who had died in previous attacks by the captives' people. After that process, they would be brought into a household where they became, as I describe it, part of the household but not part of the family. And the way that this worked out was in native languages, they would describe this as taking the place, often, of somebody who had been killed, but not taking their place in the sense of full kinship or full recognition, but taking the place as a placeholder, as someone who would do the labor of this person, someone who would symbolically occupy the space of that person. Another really interesting clue as I tried to figure out how this worked was to look at native languages. There were a series of manuscripts kept by Jesuit missionaries in the 17th century that provided thousands upon thousands of native phrases and individual words that would describe captivity in Algonquin languages, Siouan languages, Iroquoian languages. I focused on the Algonquins because they were the primary trade partners with the French. And they would describe their captives as dogs who would be, again, part of the household, but not truly part of the family.
In my work on Albany, I've come across the Haudenosaunee peoples, and they practiced a type of adoption, or at least I have read, where they tried to incorporate captives as family members, especially women and especially children. Is this happening at all in the Great Lakes peoples you're studying, or is it just incorporation by this form of slavery?
It is happening, but one of the things I expected to find when I started looking closely at these Central Algonquin peoples was something more similar to what the Iroquoians practiced. I was expecting to find instances where captives were adopted, brought into full recognition. There are all kinds of stories about captives in Iroquois rising to positions of prominence, becoming important leaders, elders, etc. And this phenomenon really was rare among the Algonquin peoples that I studied. They describe their captives in very different terminology. And the stain of being a captive, even long after having been brought into these families, remained. Everyone was aware that one's origins were not among the host people, and they would have labels on them that would stick with them throughout their life. Now, that said, the intent of this system of captivity was forced incorporation. So to the extent that the system functioned properly, it functioned to make them part of the group, right? So much different than the French slavery that they would encounter, the purpose of which was to perpetuate slavery, the purpose of which was to create more slaves through inheritance of the slave status. That was not the purpose of slavery in these indigenous communities, and rather it was to make more kin in some ways, right? First fictive kin, and then eventually, over the next generation, actual, real, sort of fully recognized kin.
What was daily life like for these captives who are now members of these new Native American communities?
Well, initially it was pretty rough, but it got significantly better over time. Initially, part of the initiation into the host community was that there would be acts of humiliation, acts of violence. They would be forced to strip their clothes off. They would be beaten. Often their hair would be shorn. They would be marked in various ways, sometimes even by the biting off of the tip of the nose or the cutting off of a finger, sometimes the cropping of an ear, all of which were markers that would then stay with that person throughout their life of their origin as a captive. Other acts of humiliation were more subtle. So men, for example, who in the Algonquin cultures of the Great Lakes and Upper Mississippi Valley were not expected to do agricultural labor. They were sort of culturally expected to do hunting and to protect via warfare, but the agricultural labor was almost all done by women and children. And male captives, even adult male captives, were forced to do agricultural labor. And that was an act of humiliation to indicate that you are a man among us, but you're not really fully among us yet. Over time, as I said, as they became more integrated, those kinds of things became more and more rare. Other things that captives would do, I mean, they were sent out on hunting and raiding parties. Male captives, again, would often walk with hunting parties, but rather than being warriors themselves, they were charged with carrying supplies, which typically, again, was a women's job. Female captives were often made wives within these communities, often secondary or tertiary wives, where they would have a role in the family of producing kin for this family, and they would be integrated into the household and eventually might take up a status that was difficult to distinguish from the other wives in the household. But initially, the distinction couldn't have been more clear. One thing that's absolutely clear, though, is that by the second generation, by the time children are born to people who had been captives in these communities, that stain was no longer with them. So if you were a child of an enslaved woman in these indigenous communities, you would not be considered a slave. Whereas in the French case, of course, if you were a child of an enslaved woman, you would absolutely be considered a slave and belong to the person whose property your mother was.
You've mentioned that the French become involved with Native American slavery. Can you tell us how they become involved and maybe really specifically how their conceptions of slavery differed from those of the Native American communities we've been discussing?
Sure. So the initial involvement came in a diplomatic setting. One aspect of indigenous slavery that I haven't discussed yet with you is that captives/slaves played a very important role as gifts in diplomatic exchanges. So as two groups would establish a peace together or establish a long-lasting diplomatic relationship, one thing that was exchanged, in addition to gifts of various kinds, to food, one thing that was exchanged were people. And a gift of a slave was thought to be one of the most powerful indicators of alliance. So when, for example, an Ottawa would encounter a French person, they would exchange gifts to solidify the alliance, one of which was often an enslaved person. That signified that the Ottawas were powerful, that they could take captives successfully. It's probably a subtle threat. You know, you can be a good ally to us, or we could do to you what we've done to this person. But it was the giving rather than the taking of life. So it was deeply symbolic of a sign of trust, a sign of goodwill. And as the French start receiving these gifts of captives, that then gives them the idea to start relying on native laborers as slaves. Now, the Indians did not introduce the concept of slavery to the French by any means. The French, of course, had been familiar with slavery for a very, very long time before this. They were currently in the 1660s and 70s when these exchanges started to occur. They were engaged in slavery in the Caribbean to a fairly large extent. They'd been trading in West Africa for 200 years by then. And there were ways in which their slavery was different, which I'll mention in a moment, but the idea of slavery itself was certainly not introduced by the native people. What was introduced was a version of slavery that was focused very much on diplomacy and alliance. And it's a slavery that was not very interested in the inheritability of slave property, in the production of commodities, but instead was interested in the sort of symbolic and demographic value of people from an enemy nation. What that partly meant was that there was also an assumed fluidity to this slavery. People who were slaves at one point could become fully integrated into the community, or people who were enslaved as part of warfare could be returned to their people as a sign of goodwill if they would make a peace pact, for example. When the French started adopting this practice of diplomatic slave exchanges, they found that their version of slavery, which put a property right on that person and made it inheritable and made it about producing valuable commodities, didn't fit very well with the indigenous idea of slavery. So, for example, they get a large number of fox slaves starting in the 17 teens. And then they decide to make peace with the Foxes at the end of this war. And the Foxes quite naturally say, well, give us back our children and we will be able to, have this peace. The problem is the French governor himself had fox slaves serving in his household, and many other French people had fox slaves in their households. Some had been shipped to the Caribbean, and they found it very difficult to have this kind of fluidity that the diplomatic approach to enslavement really demanded. And so that created all kinds of additional problems. The peace pact fell apart, warfare continued, and then recognizing the French commitment to sort of holding slaves in perpetuity, their native allies actually used that to their own advantage. So if the French tried to befriend one of the enemies of one of these native allies, they could then raid that people for slaves, give them to the French, and try to drive a wedge between the French and this other people. And they did that repeatedly across what's now the Midwest, what they would have called then the Pays d'Anjou, the upper country. So it happened with the Foxes, as I mentioned, but it also happened with the Sioux. It happened with the Plains Apaches. There are many examples where the French really wanted to expand their trade network. They really wanted to bring more people into the diplomatic fold. But because of their system of slavery, the French system of slavery being sort of perpetuated and property-based, it really didn't work out so well. And this was a method of Native people actually controlling French expansion. So Native slavery, ironically, acted in many ways to limit French power over Native peoples, which is one of the ironies I encountered in this research.
I have to imagine that in addition to being a diplomatic sort of gift, that these Native American slaves who were given to the French must also participate in the diplomacy in that they speak the languages of the Native Americans better than the French, right?
Absolutely true, but often they're speaking a different native language, right? And so giving a gift of a slave was actually quite a risk because, for example, if you were to give a Sioux, Lakota slave to a French person, they could then theoretically go back to that people, return the captive and say, here's an act of goodwill, let's be friends. So it's an act of trust, right? And the enslaved person could herself or himself facilitate that diplomatic arrangement. Like you said, they speak the native languages. They speak not only the words, but also the sort of protocols, and they understand what it takes to establish these relationships. So there are many instances where Native slaves were active participants in diplomacy, in the reconnecting of peoples, in the establishment of new relationships, and in the familiarizing of French traders, of their native allies, with the people from whom the captive was taken. That said, it can be a really perilous job as well, because captives found that as they participated in this diplomacy, they, of all the actors involved, were the ones holding the fewest cards. And they found that sometimes they would be sent on what were essentially death missions. They'd be sent to deliver a message that ended up getting them killed. And so, on the one hand, it was an empowering and a sort of culturally knitting together role that they could play. And on the other hand, it was a really dangerous and perilous game that they were involved in, often, in fact, mostly against their will.
Given the threat to Native American societies that the slaves of the French posed, did that make Native Americans very cautious as to which slaves they gifted to the French?
It made them aware of the choices of who they were giving to the French. And often, as I mentioned, they would give slaves that came from groups that they wanted to remain outside of French alliance, hoping and often succeeding that by giving these people to the French, they would make them enemies to the French. One good example of this is the Sioux Indians, who, and I call them the Sioux, even though they have particular names, Lakota, Dakota, Nakota, but in the historical sources, it's very difficult to differentiate which of these groups they come from. So even though it's imperfect, I refer to them as the Sioux. Sioux groups come to Montreal all the way from Minnesota. It's a long and difficult journey. They arrive in Montreal ready to make an alliance with the French. And as they are there in the streets of Montreal, they encounter enslaved Sioux children serving the households of French colonists in Montreal. And they're enraged. They came here to make peace, only to find their children enslaved among these people. And they demand that they get their children back. And the governor equivocates and says, well, we'll send them back next year, etc. And these diplomatic meetings that took a great deal of effort to orchestrate fall apart right on the spot. And the Sioux go back, and eventually they completely shut down all French trade in that sector for a very long time as a result. So the allied people, the natives that had given the French those slaves, succeeded in driving this wedge between the French and the Sioux. And that meant that the French were not going to be trading with and arming their enemies. So the presence of captives among the French could be manipulated by native peoples, not so much by the enslaved people themselves, although that could be done too, but also by those, more to the point, by those who were trading the slaves to the French.
Often when historians talk about Native Americans in this early American period, in the colonial period, they mention dependency, that Native Americans become dependent on European relations and European goods. It sounds like Native Americans in some ways viewed their captives, their slaves, as goods to be traded to the French, and the French became dependent upon the labor of those slaves. How did prolonged interactions between the French and Native American peoples of the Great Lakes regions between the 17th and 18th centuries change the way that both the French and Native American peoples practiced slavery?
That's a great question. I mean, on the Native side, there were two changes that I talk about at the greatest length in the book, and there are others, of course, I could highlight, but the two that strike me as the most important. One is that it made captive raiding profitable on its own terms in a way that it wasn't prior to the ability to trade to a colonial power. So if you're a native village in the upper country, in the sort of western Great Lakes region, and you're deciding whether or not to go on a raid against an enemy, there are all kinds of things that would mitigate against that would argue against that. The potential for reprisals, the fact that going on a raid meant that you weren't also going hunting or fishing. There were trade-offs, there were choices that had to be made. Whereas when the French start paying more and more in terms of goods and what we'd call money, but in terms of exchange rates for these captives, Native people found that they could actually raid and gain more by trading those slaves away than they could by doing subsistence activities, hunting and fishing in particular, because those were typically male activities. So it shifted the calculus of the place of violence, and it made it more profitable. And because the French were exerting pressure with everything from arms trade to disease to expansion physically and demographically, the danger that one's enemies might become friends with the French and become strengthened by firearms and other things actually gave you an additional incentive to raid against your enemies and trade them to the French, as I've described. And so there are all kinds of incentives that pile up over the course of the 18th century, encouraging and rewarding Native peoples for raiding rather than the historical practice prior to French arrival, which was these raids were very rare. There were all kinds of arguments against them, and they almost never became important to the point where it was a primary activity of any group ever. That changes for some people in the 18th century. So that's one major shift, is that raids themselves become more profitable, captive trading becomes an activity that's rewarded on its own terms. The second thing that becomes really noticeable in the records is that when I went through all the baptismal registries and all the colonial court records, et cetera, I created a large database that was able to identify about 2,700 individual enslaved people in New France. And what I found when I did the demographic numbers was that in about the 1730s into the 1740s is when French households started demanding female captives much more than male captives. By then, they had realized that Canada was never going to produce really profitable commodities. They tried to produce hemp for a while for the Navy. They tried to produce peas and other things that would help feed the Caribbean, none of which really worked out very well. So by the 1730s and 40s, they resigned themselves. This was going to be a system of slavery that was largely urban, largely domestic, and therefore, because of French cultural expectations, largely female. And by about the 1740s, the vast majority of enslaved women, native enslaved women in New France, started to be female for the first time. What that meant is that in the native towns that were capturing these people, what they used to do was to incorporate women and children into their towns and trade away the men. Now, that didn't hurt demographically at all, because the women, as I described, were what they described as kin makers. They talked about them as having really important reproductive roles in these societies. But when you start trading away the women and children to the French, it really puts pressure on society's ability to rebound demographically after disease epidemics, after clashes of warfare. And it's, I think, no coincidence that it's in these very decades that places like the Illinois country start to have really sharp drops in population, and that there is a reduced ability to sort of bounce back from those moments of crisis.
Did the people of New France ever attempt to adopt African slavery as practiced in British North America or even in the French Caribbean, or was it just totally infeasible?
They did try several times. I mean, and there were small numbers of enslaved Africans in New France. In Montreal, over the course of the 18th century, it's about 85% Native American and about 15% African and African American, although a big proportion of the enslaved Africans and African Americans in Montreal actually came from New York. During colonial wars, they would capture slaves from the farms and plantations they would raid and send them back up to New France. In terms of direct importation, there were many petitions that were made to the Crown and to slave trading companies to bring a shipload or two or many of enslaved Africans to the St. Lawrence Valley. But because the Caribbean is where the most profitable agriculture was, and because they felt like they never had enough labor to satisfy their sort of insatiable greed for more and more sugar plantations, the Crown said it really isn't going to work out, and the companies just felt like it wasn't very profitable. So individual slaveholders would bring people of African descent into New France, but it was really fairly rare. Quebec City had a higher proportion of enslaved Africans, and that's largely explained by the fact that it was the administrative center of the colony, and many of the people who were in the upper echelons of the colony had connections to other colonial places, and so they might bring up from their plantation in Martinique, for example, a few enslaved Africans. But by and large, it was not really a feasible thing. And because enslaved Africans cost quite a lot more, the distance of transportation, there are all kinds of reasons I discuss in the book, you would have to have had some very profitable, productive use, sort of labor that these people would be doing in order for it to be financially feasible. So it really just never took off. And it remained all the way until the British took over at the end of the 7 Years' War, largely a Native American phenomenon.
Throughout our discussion, you've dropped hints about how you went about researching your book and uncovering the story of Native American slaves. And I know from Greg O'Malley, who talked to us in episode 8, he said that it was just incredibly difficult to come around and uncover the personal stories of African slaves. Could you talk about your process and how you went about uncovering the stories of these Native American slaves and maybe the sources you used and the difficulties you encountered?
Yes, it's a perennial problem in the study of enslaved people that because they don't leave behind the kinds of records that we use to reconstruct personal stories, we end up encountering them as statistics, as an item on a list, a person mentioned in an inheritance, a baptismal registry that just notes their baptism and their godparents and their sort of new Catholic name. The process for me was just long and painstaking. Fortunately, there had been a historian in New France in Quebec named Marcel Trudel who had started this process 50 years earlier and had done sort of a genealogical dictionary by going through a bunch of records. And of course, it was very incomplete, but it was a starting point for me. And so I built on that, and I built, as I mentioned, a database of any time I encountered an individual, I would create a new sort of a new cell on an Excel spreadsheet for them. And then I'd put in as much detail as I could. Did I have their birth date? Did I have their death date? Did I have who claimed to be their master? Did I have the nation from which they were taken, their nation of birth, whether it was, Renard, Meskwaki, etc., or Sioux or whatever? Did I have any information about relationships they had, family members, children, spouses, etc.? And then do I have any sources that would allow a fuller sort of narrative of their lives? The richest source turned out for me to be a set of court documents in Montreal There was a series of judicial records that were preserved from the 17th and 18th century, more than 6,300 court cases. The dossiers remain fully intact. They're now available online and searchable in some limited way. But I spent 4 months in the archive reading through summaries and then the files themselves of as many of these cases as I could. And I found some 30-plus cases that revolved around, or at least involved as witnesses, et cetera, enslaved Indians in Montreal. And those gave me the very best stories. So the 6th chapter of the book is structured around the stories of 4 of these individuals, each of them representing a broad sort of swath of experience among the enslaved. One of whom, for example, his name was Joseph, and he was a slave to a man who was an infamous smuggler and illegal trader. He actually used his slave Joseph to trade illegal goods around the island. And he told his slave that if you get caught, I'm going to say that you stole this from me, and then you'll be punished very severely. So that was his cover. And it gave Joseph a lot of mobility around the island, but of course it put him in a very dangerous and a very difficult position. And eventually he showed up in a court case where they had kind of figured out that something was wrong and they were interrogating him. And a lot of documents were generated to tell me a lot about Joseph's life. A similar story of Marie Joachim, for example, who had fallen in love with a French soldier. And the soldier had convinced her to steal from her master's warehouse, and that he would keep the goods, and then eventually they'd sell them and run off and have a happy life together. Well, as you might predict, he sells all the goods himself, and then when she's caught finally stealing from her master, he says he knows nothing about it. He hangs her out to dry. And there's this moment of real pathos when you're reading the documents, and she says over and over, but he said he was in love with me. He said he was in love with me. You can imagine this sort of teenage young woman who's had already a series of pretty bad traumas in her life. This last one was almost too much for her to take. And on, right? So that these cases allowed me to see both the sort of human side of enslaved people and a wide range of experiences that showed that there were actually many slaveries practiced in New France, and that the experience of one in one place at one time would be quite different from another. And to me, this was an ethical commitment. I felt that if I'm going to write about enslaved people, it was very important to me to treat them as fully human beings, to uncover as much as possible their desires, their stories, their motivations, their relationships. And so it was a useful device in terms of structuring a chapter, but it was much more than that to me. It was to me sort of my ethical stance that any story about enslaved people needs to be first and foremost about enslaved people.
Talk about historian problems. You're like thankful that these court records exist, and then horrified that these people had to really endure what they endured to be in the records.
That's absolutely right. In fact, I had early on in my research this very harrowing experience where I came across an autopsy report where there had been a slave murdered by a soldier. And the surgeon, as they called him, was brought in to examine the body of this enslaved person. And there was a great deal of detail in this document about the conflict that led up to the murder, and then about the physical wounds that had led to the slave's death. And I was able to really reconstruct, all of the events leading up to this person's death. And on the one hand, I felt so excited to have this very detailed portrait of a conflict between an enslaved person and a soldier. This soldier draws a sword from somewhere, I'm not sure where. And all of a sudden, it struck me just how horrible it was to feel any kind of excitement, any kind of satisfaction for encountering this document. Because on the one hand, of course, I need documents like this to bring him back to life, in a sense, right? But on the other hand, of course, I can't. Of course, I can't undo any of the horrors that sort of brought this document into my hands. And so there's this moment where I really found this this tension that really stayed with me throughout the book. And I tried, instead of skirting that tension, to build it into it, right? To build in the tensions between the power and exploitation that slavery represents, but not so much that we efface the full humanity of those who were enslaved.
Let's move into the time warp. This is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently.
The time warp. Historians can't predict the future, but they can speculate about what might have been.
Brett, in your opinion, what might have happened if the Native American practice of slavery had not been a part of how Native peoples conducted diplomacy with the French? Would the colonists of New France have practiced Native American slavery or slavery at all?
I think there's no question they would have practiced some form of slavery, because the Caribbean, as I mentioned, was the most important French colonial endeavor, and it was all based on slavery. And in New France, they so badly wanted to succeed like their Caribbean counterparts. So one can imagine that they would have maybe had more enslaved Africans. Maybe they would have engaged in a trade with New England or New York, probably illegal smuggling of some sort or another. So you can imagine that there would have been slavery. So in other words, it's important to note that Native peoples participating in this exchange did not create slavery in New France. They were not to blame for slavery in New France. But the nature of that slavery would have been very, very different, because it was the existence of this system of diplomatic exchange that simultaneously could serve French interests of developing relationships for the fur trade, developing military alliances to protect their colony, while sourcing enslaved people. And so because of that confluence of interests, the nature of slavery became what it was. I've had people misread my argument to suggest that that is a way of blaming natives for French slavery in New France. I think that's just completely not at all what I'm trying to argue. But I think you're absolutely right that it would have been different. It would have changed the nature of it, and it probably would have been a smaller phenomenon within the colony.
What are you researching about now? Are you continuing your work with slavery in New France?
I'm continuing to work on slavery and on French colonialism, but not specifically slavery in New France. So I'm right now writing a book with Chris Hodson, who wrote a wonderful book about the Acadian diaspora. And it's a book that's called Discovering Empire, and it's a history of the French Atlantic world from the early modern period, the late medieval period, I guess. The first chapter actually covers the Crusades, all the way up through Haitian independence in the late 18th century and ending in the early 19th century. And it looks at French interactions with Africa, North and South America, and the Caribbean, and tries to understand some of the relationships along the lines of what Chris and I did in our previous books, which was to look at how French colonists and merchants and lawmakers bring a certain set of expectations to this encounter, but of course how Africans and Brazilians and Caribs and Native Americans in North America would bring their own sets of experiences to these encounters, and how that sort of shaped the mutual world that these people tried to create.
And where is the best place to look for more information about you, your forthcoming book, and how we can get in contact with you if we still have questions about Indigenous slavery in New France?
Well, I have a website at the William and Mary History Department. It's probably the easiest. It describes my research and it has my email address. I have a page on academia.edu, which also could be a place that someone could look to have some of my publications listed and some of my current work described.
And you're on Twitter too, aren't you, Brett?
I am occasionally. I tweet sporadically. There are moments when I get into it and moments when I go weeks without checking it. So I'm certainly not a dedicated Twitter user, but I do have my moments.
Brett, thank you so much for joining us today and expanding our knowledge of what early American slavery was like throughout the continent.
Well, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Prior to Brett's work, the practice of Native American or Indigenous slavery by the colonists of New France stood as a little-known aspect of early American history, because there aren't a lot of documents left to tell us about that story, and because the documents that do remain make it hard for us to understand the story they convey unless we do a lot of additional research. As Brett revealed, he spent months poring through the documents and legal records in the Canadian archives, and he researched linguistic histories and material objects to get at the story of Native American slavery. Thanks in part to his persistent efforts, we now know that early Americans practiced more than just one type of slavery. And I think this is important for us to understand because slaves were people, and their experiences deserve to be understood and remembered. If you would like more information about Brett, his book, Bonds of Alliance, plus links to the other books and websites we talked about today, check out the show notes page for this episode, benfranklinsworld.com/064. Or you could locate this information by clicking on the show notes link right in the Ben Franklin's World app. The app is free and you can download it for your iOS or Android smartphone or tablet by searching for Ben Franklin's World in your favorite app store or by visiting benfranklinsworld.com/apps. If you enjoy this podcast, would you please tell your friends, family members, and acquaintances about it? The best way for people to discover Ben Franklin's World is by word-of-mouth recommendations. Please help our fellow history lovers find our show by telling people about it. Finally, what other aspects of early American history do you think are understudied? Send your answers to Liz at benfranklinsworld.com, tweet me at Liz Covart, or post a comment on the show notes page for this episode or in our social community on Facebook.
And remember, never leave till tomorrow that which you can do today.